Hello, my name is Cliff Towner. I am a member of the Small Band Program Committee for the College Band Directors National Association. I am pleased to join CBDNA as part of this oral history project, which is an initiative designed to provide those in the profession and interested observers with a historical look at the development of the organization over its years, its leaders, key initiatives, and how the organization came to be what it is today. Today, I'm pleased to welcome a special guest, Dr. Acton Ostling Jr. Dr. Ostling, welcome.
Thank you.
Dr. Ostling, you spent about 21 years as the director of bands at the Louisville Symphony Band, and you spent 8 years as secretary and treasurer of CBDNA. And then, of course, I think we're all familiar with your 1978 seminal study on wind literature. So with those things in mind, let's start. Can you start by just speaking a little bit about your background, how you got involved with CBDNA, when you were elected secretary-treasurer, those kind of details?
All right. Well, I have some thoughts I've put down here on my early association. Of course, I did my undergraduate and master's degrees at the University of Michigan. And so I was in Ann Arbor for 5 years. And for 4 of those years, I was on the band staff. And for the last 3 of those 4 years, I had a title of student assistant to the directors. So I was very, very intimately working as a student with the band program and with Dr. William Ravelli. So that gave me a good start. And since Bill Ravelli was the founder of CBDNA, and of course very interested in everything going on, he not only would mention things as kind of in side comments during rehearsals, and also when we would be with him in staff meetings and so forth. So I got a very, very great interest as an undergraduate student in CBDNA just for that reason. Then in I believe it was in 1956, the national conference was held in Chicago, and we were one of the performing groups. And one of the personal things aside, I remember this, it always has been a rather disappointment that we were supposed to perform in Orchestra Hall. And wouldn't you know, the Borg Warner building right next to Orchestra Hall was under construction, and they did something where the side wall in Orchestra Hall sank and cracked the ceiling.
Oh, no.
And that meant that Orchestra Hall had to be closed. No performances could be given there, and we had to go to a theater somewhere else, and I can't remember which it was. It wasn't the Auditorium Theater. But at any rate, we played at that 1956 conference, so we played, and of course were around with the things going on. So that added to all of the comments that I'd heard over the years. I also had an association with CBDNA before I went to Michigan. My first job right out of college was doing the band and orchestra at one of the high schools in West Hartford, Connecticut. And it was so close to Yale University that I used to go down to band sessions that Keith Wilson would organize at Yale. And Keith and I became very good friends. He told me I was the band director in Connecticut that paid most attention to what he was lining up there at Yale. And we became very good friends. I was only there 3 years before I went to the University of Maryland as assistant director of bands. But we became very, very good friends during the 3 years that I was a high school band director, and that also was a big part of my interest in CBDNA. And then in 1962, I became assistant director of bands to Hubert P. Henderson at the University of Maryland in College Park. So 1962 was my first national conference, and Hugh and I both drove to Chicago to attend that national conference. and I was really eagerly anticipating it. There are two things that I remember from that very well, and that was that CBDNA had engaged, and I think Ravelli was the chairman of this, in an instrumentation study for 2 whole years. And as part of that instrumentation study, they had come up with what was supposed to be a perfect band instrumentation. And it, now as you look at it, this is considered to not be the case. We don't worry about what a perfect band instrumentation is. But at that time, CBDNA was very, very much involved in what was the reason that composers were not composing for band. And it was thought, well, maybe it's because they don't know the band as well as they know the orchestra. So the idea was, if we could come up with a perfect instrumentation to present to a composer, maybe more of them would be interested. So they ran an instrumentation study, came up with it. To make a long story short, they came up with a 60-piece band instrumentation. And then Morton Gould was commissioned to write a piece of music for this specific instrumentation, and that happened to be his 12-tone piece called Prisms. I love the thing, but it was premiered at that 1962 convention, see. The instrumentation study had been completed in 1960, and then 1962, they premiered, the IU band premiered, and I think it was under Ronald Gregory, premiered the Prisms at a session. And here's another interesting sidelight. Here in Louisville, quite a few years ago, the Louisville Orchestra was recording one of their recordings of pieces of Morton Gould, and he happened to be sitting there at our recital hall when I went in to work one morning. I didn't know he was going to be there. Yeah. But I recognized him and went over and sat with him, and all during that time I sat with him, going over the scores that were being recorded and so forth, and I had plenty of time to chat with him. So I asked him, I said, Prisms is the only 12-tone piece that I know that you ever composed, because he used this opportunity to do classic 12-tone. Mm-hmm. And so he thought for a minute, and he said, my Jekyll and Hyde variations for orchestra come very close. But he said, no, I think that Prisms is the only classic 12-tone piece I ever wrote. And there's that one movement where he takes single notes from one instrument to another. Boy, that's one of the hardest things I've ever tried to rehearse.
Yeah.
But it was premiered, and then there was, at that 1962 convention in Chicago, there was an astounding concert by the University of Iowa Symphony Band under Fred Ebbs. And he was the one who first discovered Schmidt's Dionysiac. Mm-hmm. And he played it on that concert. And if you don't think that didn't knock us all off our seats, in 1962, to hear that thing for the very first time, and he had gotten the original. Now, right now, the only way you get it is renting a wind ensemble version that has reconciled all the parts so it can be done with around 50 players. Mm-hmm. But the original, I counted one time, it takes 75 individual players to play all the parts of the original score. And he had gotten the original score from Paris, and of course it came with the French transpositions of the tuba parts and baritone parts into transposed bass clef. So the first thing he had to do was to get copyists to copy those parts out. But he had done all that work and simply presented it at this concert at the 1962 convention. And then he also played a piece by Morton Gould that none of us knew, and it was called Concertet for Viola and Band. Now, I've never been able to play that piece. I always wanted to, but he did it, and the violist of the Stradivari Quartet from the University of Iowa was the soloist. So the concert he played had those two stunning pieces, brand new that nobody knew on it, and I've always remembered that. So that 1962 convention resonates in my mind very much. So that was how I got started with CBDNA. I talked about 1962 and the premiere of Prisms of Morton Gould and the Iowa Symphony Band concert that was so stunning that year. Well, I sort of had a really wonderful 1-2 introduction to CBDNA because the 64 conference followed right after that last 1962 one in Chicago. The big thing in 1964, of course, was the premiere of Copeland's Emblems. And but in addition to Emblems, we also had Ingolf Dahl there in person to give a presentation about his Sinfonietta for band, and Gunther Schuller was also there to give a presentation about his work for band Meditation. And so it was just a tremendous opportunity to meet those two composers, but also that they were there to talk about their pieces. Regarding Emblems, that 64 conference was Keith Wilson's conference as president, and Keith had used his personal association with Copeland, knew him very well in order to get that commission established. And it's interesting the way in which he did it. He got 200 CBDNA members to pledge that they would pay $10 more than the purchase price when it was finally published. And that would give Copeland his $2,000 commission. Find it interesting, $2,000 for Emblems, wow. But that's how Keith organized it, and Aaron Copeland, to his credit, wrote the piece without having the commission, because the money for the commission was going to come after the sale of it, after it was published. The problem was that the reaction to Emblems was not positive on the part of the profession. And the thing that's interesting about, I think you can understand it, but it also is not the best incident in CBDNA's history. Because of the negative reaction, Keith had trouble getting people, enough people to follow through with their pledge. And it took him a long, long time before he was able to assemble the money and give it to Copeland. Which is really a problem. You can understand it from one standpoint, however, is the profession went into that expecting Billy the Kid Revisited or Appalachian Spring for band is what they wanted, and that's not what they got. They got something far better. I remember it was just my second conference. I was just exhilarated when Bill Schaefer's Trojan Symphonic Band started playing Emblems. I was just exhilarated, and the reason was it was so clear to me that Copeland had not written down. This was real Copeland, and that in and of itself just had me buoyant, and I was so excited about that piece, hearing it premiered, and was absolutely shocked at the negative reaction in chatting with my colleagues after that performance. But it was not received well, and that caused problems in coming up with the money. I think what Keith had told Copeland was, look, here's how I'll get you the commission, and when it's done, 200 bands will be playing your piece. And so with that in mind, what I thought I would do is to read from Vivian Perlis's and Aaron Copland's oral history they put together, titled Copland Since 1943. And there's actually a whole page, half of one page and half of the next, in which Copland talks about emblems himself. And I'd like to, just so it doesn't remain buried in a music history book on library shelves, for our purposes, I just thought it would be nice to read a portion of one paragraph about what Copland himself actually said about emblems. He says, Schaefer, meaning Bill Schaefer, who was director of bands at USC, Schaefer sent me a tape of the premiere, which took place in Tempe, Arizona, 18th of December, 1964. And he expressed gratitude on behalf of the Trojans. But I sensed that the work was received with some disappointment. I did not hear emblems played until the New York performance by the combined bands of Columbia and Harvard universities at Carnegie Hall, 10th of February, 1965. Alas, my new band piece was not taken up by 200 bands. I had purposely avoided serial composition. Nevertheless, emblems was at first considered dissonant and angular. In time, it has come into the college band repertory. One last thing that I would say about that 64 convention was the participation of, and what they called it at the time, the University of Southern California Trojan Symphonic Band. And William Schaefer was its conductor. They not only played a concert in which they premiered emblems, but separate from their concert, they performed the Sinfonietta for band of Ingolf Dahl after he had given his presentation. Now, isn't that a major contribution to a conference?
Yeah, that's a lot of work to put those together.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's impressive.
But it was a very, very, very meaningful conference, and it was my second one, and I'll just never, ever forget being there.
Did you have, after those two, I mean, you started out with those two, and you've been to so many since then. Has there been a conference that's even come close to that in your mind?
Boy, oh boy, that's an interesting. In many, I guess I can't point out it exactly like that. I've enjoyed them all. There was one that was hosted by John Painter at Northwestern University, and it was in 1987. And Don Huntsberger was president. But John, anytime he hosted a conference like this, he always would make part of the conference going down to Orchestra Hall and hearing the Chicago Symphony.
Yeah.
And at this particular one, Michael Tilson Thomas was conducting the Chicago Symphony, and part of that program was, I don't know if it was a premiere or just a presentation of Charles Woronen's Fourth Piano Concerto. Now, this first movement of this piano concerto has a part for timp toms out the wazoo, as they say. I mean, you got to have about, a couple dozen of them in all pitches. It's as virtuosic as it can be. Well, Patricia Dash from Eastman had just been appointed to the percussion section of the Chicago Symphony. And it was Don Huntsberger's convention as his presidency. So there are 300 college band directors in the audience when this gets played. And Patsy Dash was assigned that timp tom part, and she just wailed it. So Tilson Thomas comes out, and as part of the bows, he acknowledges Patsy Dash, and immediately 300 college band directors are on their feet roaring. And you know, it kind of took Tilson Thomas back. I mean, he had no reason to know why this was taking place, but I thought that was a fascinating incident in terms of what took place. And I think maybe, yes, I finally have an answer for you, Cliff.
Okay.
I would say that the one that really, really probably hit me in the same way was Gary Hill's New York conference. Now, there's where you had all the concerts in Carnegie Hall, but also I'll never forget the brain research session that he had organized, where those experts in terms of brain research showed us those slides that showed categorically that you're on the emotional side of it when you first start into music, but the more that you learn about it, both sides of the brain come into place. And they actually had documented evidence of that, and that was just fascinating. So, and then if I remember right, there was a critic, Anne Majette, and another critic were there discussing things. And I know that there was some feeling of disappointment over that conference because the New York press had not taken notice of it. But that was to be expected. You know, they just go their own way regardless. And of course, there's Corigliano's Symphony being premiered in Carnegie Hall on Sunday afternoon, and the fact that that did not get a review was disappointing, I know, to a lot of CBDNAers. But at 5 o'clock that afternoon, James Levine was down in the recital hall giving a performance of chamber music with the Metropolitan Opera Orchestra musicians. And to me, it's just obvious why the New York Times reviewer went there. That whole conference, where it was, the location, what it took to put that all together and how successful it was, that's just still in my mind is one of the highlights. I had another note that in terms of my early association, of course, I became director of bands at the University of Maryland in 1965, and that was 3 years before I became Secretary-Treasurer. And one thing that was going on at the national conferences and at the regional conferences then that was really, I thought, something we all looked forward to was every regional conference had 6 new pieces played by various ensembles. And then at the regionals, we voted on which one we liked the best. And that was sent on to the national. And at the national convention, each of the 6 pieces that had been voted the best from each of the regional conferences were played at the national conference. What would happen is the host, it really was up to the host. I remember when I hosted one of the regional conferences involved in this at the University of Maryland when I was director of bands. It was just before I went out to Iowa State. And I was able to get Arnold Gabriel and the Air Force Band to come out to play the new pieces, which was really terrific.
Yeah.
But I did that as host. And as a matter of fact, I was having trouble trying to get 6 of them, and so I threw a piece I'd written when I did it as a graduate student at Michigan into the mix in order to get 6. No, the 6 would be organized by the host. And of course, the host would confer with people and so forth, but then those 6 would get played, and it was just voted on by whoever happened to attend the Eastern Convention would vote on those 6.
Got it.
And then they would be sent to the National, and the 6 were played at the National, and there was a time when those who had attended the National Conference voted on which one of the 6 they liked the best. So you'd end up with one that would just be, well, this is the one that was voted the best at a national conference. Now, eventually what happened is that began to be seen as not scientific enough as a process, and maybe we ought to go in the direction of simply deciding certain composers we wanted to get to write pieces and so forth. So it became something that the thought about the process, problems with the process, began to overshadow what it was accomplishing. But boy, I can't tell you how I anticipated hearing those 6 pieces, and then hearing the 6 from each division at the national, and then whatever would be the piece voted the best at the national. So it was a very, very important aspect of getting started in terms of CBDNA and getting new pieces written for band.
Do you recall when that process started?
No, I don't.
Okay.
I just know it was in place when I became a member in 1962. So it was some time before that, but it was around 56 or 58 that this started.
So you took office then in 1968?
Yeah, and it's kind of an interesting story as to how I became a secretary-treasurer. And that is at the 1960. Well, first of all, the famous 1964 first conference outside of Chicago held at Arizona State. You know, we just had a national conference where we had a session on that. And Bob Reynolds and Dave Whitwell and I were there because I think we're the only 3 living who were at that, as far as we know, at that conference. And we did that session in Tempe, back in 2019.
Mm-hmm.
What I found interesting is there are the 3 of us, and we were each classmates at Michigan, which I find fascinating. Bob was 1 year ahead of David and myself, and David and I were in the same class. So that is just an interesting side thing. Well, one of the things I mentioned at the 2019 session talking about the 64 convention was the election of James Jorgensen as vice president.
Mm-hmm.
And it had been one of these, situations in which the vice president, there was no president-elect at the time, the vice presidency was automatically, even though they went through the election process, the vice president had always been elected president. All right. Well, we're out there. This is the first, the first national conference held away from Chicago. So we're out there in Tempe, Arizona, and someone just says, "Are there any other nominations for vice president?" And Jack Lee, it was at the University of Arizona, he said, yeah, I got one. It was one of those astounding moments. Nobody ever does that in a meeting, right?
Right.
So he does it, and he puts James Jorgensen. He said he's done a fabulous job as Western Division president. I think he'd make a great CBDNA president. So we're out there. We're in the Western Division. There's a preponderance of Western and Northwestern people there, and Jorgensen gets elected vice president instead of the vice president, Jim Dunlop, who, thought he was going to automatically become president. Well, okay. So at that same time, Manly Whitcomb was going to be president. So it was Manly Whitcomb as president, Jim Jorgensen as vice president. Okay. Well, at the election when the next election takes place, Guy Duker gets elected vice president, but he has just been assigned to be secretary-treasurer. And he took over from Charlie Manelli, who had done it for 12 years, and Guy Duker, almost immediately after he becomes secretary-treasurer, gets elected vice president.
Mm.
Well, this happened at the 1967 conference at the University of Michigan, and I had just become director of bands, taking over from Hugh Henderson. in 1965. So this would have been my first CBDNA as director of bands at Maryland. Well, before he got elected vice president, I just happened to go up to him and say, Guy, let me tell you something. We've got a complete aggressograph machine with metal plates of the whole CBDNA addresses. I don't know if this would ever be of use to you, but let me tell you that any time it would, I've got it there and you can use it as Secretary-Treasurer. Well, then he gets elected vice president.
I can see this coming. Oh, man.
And he gets elected vice president. And so when he does, he tells the board about this offer of mine, and that I'm sitting there with all the CBDNA, membership already on addressograph metal plates. So the offer was made to me to become Secretary-Treasurer. And I was very young, and at the time and so forth. But that's what did it. So I started in and did it for 8 years. It was kind of an interesting time for me because, as it turned out, and I didn't know when I got appointed Secretary-Treasurer, then in the spring, I went off, got the Iowa State University position.
Okay.
So here I get Secretary-Treasurer because I've got these addressograph plates at Maryland, and then I changed jobs.
So now you no longer have the addressograph.
I no longer have the addressograph, right. I go off to Iowa State, and so in '68, I became Secretary-Treasurer, and it's my first year of being Secretary-Treasurer was my last year at the University of Maryland. Now, one of the things that was fortunate at Iowa State which I did not have as much access to at Maryland, I had access to a secretary who could do the band work, but she was in the School of Music office. Yep. And just considered one of the music secretaries who could do the band stuff.
Oh, that's cool.
But at Iowa State, the band program there had been run for years by Frank Pearsall. Mm-hmm. And so there was a band secretary, a full-time band secretary at Iowa State. So that helped very much.
So when you took office, and you took office in '68, moved to Iowa State, what were your thinkings? What were your goals or objectives for being in this position?
Well, I of course wanted to continue it because I enjoyed the work very much, and I enjoyed the contact it gave and the knowledge of the profession it was giving me to be going over all these names, you see, and so forth. So I very much wanted to continue it, and I did for the 4 years at Iowa State. And then the most interesting was then I decided to go to grad school. Right. So I'm Secretary-Treasurer for the 2 years that I'm not in a position, but I'm in grad school. And then I end up at the University of Louisville. And, one time I can't remember who it was, but a grad student was doing research on something historically and contacted me and wanted to have me discuss with him my transfer of the Secretary-Treasurer, why I left the position and why it changed and all of that. Mm-hmm. And it's what I'm going to tell you is something I think very interesting because Dave Whitwell became president, and so Carl Holvik was the last president I served, and Dave had a new Secretary-Treasurer, which I'll get to in a minute. When I got to Louisville, after having run it for 2 years without any secretary except my wife helping me, but I wanted to continue it because, of course, I don't know where I'm going to end up, right?
Yep.
And my thought was, well, I'll be like Charlie Minnelli. I'll keep going at this until some point where in the future where it seems to be necessary to make a change. So I fully intended to continue wherever I ended up continue as Secretary-Treasurer. But when I got to Louisville, Louisville turned out to be a very different kind of band situation from the normal university. First of all, it had been a municipal supported private school for so many years. It had just recently joined the state system, so it only recently had become a state university. And it just did not have the resources for me to really be able to continue doing what I'd been doing as Secretary-Treasurer. And Dave Whitwell very much wanted a Secretary-Treasurer closer to him out in California.
Mm-hmm.
So it happened at at the same time that I realized, well, I can't really continue this at Louisville. Dave wants to have his own Secretary-Treasurer closer to him out on the West Coast. So it worked out very, very well, and that's where it went to Robert Briggs.
Okay.
Who for 3 years, who was an assistant to Jim Berdahl at the University of California, Berkeley. And he became Secretary-Treasurer, and so he was Secretary-Treasurer for Dave's presidency. And I just noticed myself in going over some things on the website, I just noticed that he did it for 3 years. So that meant that in going into, I can't remember now exactly who became president after Dave, but whoever it was, I think they changed to Richard Floyd, in the middle of that biennium. But at any rate, that's how the change took place, and it all worked out very well. One thing I do remember is when I got all the materials from Guy Duker, when he sent me all the national materials he had as Secretary-Treasurer, I was really surprised that the national materials did not have a complete set of the books of proceedings. And so between those that I had from the conferences I'd attended, it also turned out that a music history professor named Bryce Jordan at the University of Maryland had started his career as band director at Hardin-Simmons College in Texas. So he had those that he had attended as a college band director before he went into musicology and administration. And then it just turned out that the longtime director of bands at the University of Louisville from 1938 to 1958 was named Ernest Lyon. And he was if you go back in the old books of proceedings, he was very, very prominent in terms of the Committee on New Music for Band.
Okay.
And so he had proceedings that he had purchased or had gotten while he was involved in all of this. So between mine and those friends of mine, I was able to assemble a complete set of books of proceedings for the national materials.
That must have taken forever.
Well, yeah, I tell you what.
That's a huge job.
Well, I tell you what happened was I had the ones that Bryce Jordan gave me when I was at Maryland and just took them with me. And then when I got to Louisville, of course, Ernest Lyon gave me those that he had.
Right.
So that's how I ended up with them, and they're now in Maryland.
It took you basically all 8 years to assemble that to assemble those full book of proceedings. Meanwhile, you're doing all the ones of during your keeping record during your tenure as well. Yeah, right. Yeah, and I'm doing the ones for 4 of the national conferences myself, and and when in getting in preparation for this, when I look over those 8 years and the number of moves that I made and the changes in my situation, but I just kept it going. Now, were you able to? Did you have access in Louisville to computers and stuff to digitize that, or was this all in paper format still?
It was all in paper format, and it went out to Bob Briggs in paper format. And it's my understanding that Bob Briggs, for the 3 years he did it that way, and it was Dick Floyd was the one who began to use the computer to take care of all of this. Now, you could check with him on that, but that's what I recall.
Okay. So and I'm not trying to make that any smaller than it is, because that's a huge task, assembling all those complete books of procedures and so forth and so on. Were there any other major accomplishments or goals that you were able to achieve in those 8 years, or was that your singular focus?
There are several things that happened during those 8 years that I put down here. I tell you what, I had some notes here about the presidents that I served. So maybe I could start going through that, and that'll get to some of these things.
Sure.
But the one thing where it also, one of the questions that is there is, what are you most proud of during your time? I think what I would say about that is, at the end, CBDNA produced a book through MENC called the College and University Band. So let me talk a little bit about that. At one of the board meetings, I can't remember when, somebody brought up the idea, we have all of these sessions, like the instrumentation study and the perfect instrumentation band and all of these various research projects over the years. And, wouldn't there be others out there in the field that might be interested in some of this material? And so in the book, Dave Whitwell, who ended up being in on the project, he talks about an MENC president named Lewis Worson, who had talked about making a CBDNA source book of some kind. That's what he wanted to call it. At that time, MENC was printing source books on various topics that could be purchased.
Okay.
And so this was going to be a CBDNA source book of sessions taken from the Book of Proceedings that might be of interest to the profession in general.
Right.
And I was at work on that and starting to put it together toward the end of my time. And when Dave Whitwell became president, of course, with all of that historical work he'd been involved with, he very much wanted to be involved in how this all turned out. So what was going to end up being a CBDNA source book put together by me ended up being a book. He wanted a title on it. He wanted a title other than CBDNA source book. So he was the one that chose the College and University Band. And he looked over the materials that I had assembled, and he didn't think they represented the history of the profession well enough. And of course, I couldn't disagree on that. It's because some of the people he wanted represented had not done sessions, see.
Mm-hmm.
So there wasn't a big project in the Books of Proceedings to represent that. So he went back through all the materials and pulled out things that would represent people who may not have been involved in big research projects and sessions. And therefore, instead of a CBDNA source book, it became the College and University Band, compiled by both of us. And it's a very, very good book. That I would say probably is the thing that I'd be, under the question, what are you most proud of? I think it'd probably be that book that Dave Whitwell and I put together. Then I think I can get at some things. If you have questions that you want to interject, do so. But I thought what I might do is go through the presidents that I served and what I remember about them. and that is the first president was Jim Jorgensen. Now, Jim had, that election in '64 where he became vice president when it should have been Jim Dunlop if things had gone according to Hoyle,
Right.
Jim was at Penn State and really was vice president and seemed to be the logical one to become vice. Well, anyway, Jim Jorgensen got elected vice president. Now, his conference was going to be at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, in 1969, and it was going to be with W.J. Julian as host. Now, you probably remember that the Tempe, Arizona in '64 was held during December out in Tempe because it was the first one to go away from Chicago, but it was held at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
So it was held in December of '64, and then they decided that it would be better to go into the spring rather than December away from Chicago.
Right.
Because of people wanting to attend the Midwest.
Right. Yep.
And so that's when they decided to put the CBDNA National into the spring. So even though it's in the biennium, you go to 1967 at Michigan because it's in the spring semester,
Yep.
In February. And then '69 was at UT Knoxville with J. Julian. Jim Jorgensen was the most visionary of the four presidents I served. I served Jim Jorgensen, Richard Bowles, Guy Duker, Richard Bowles, and Carl Holvik. And Jim was really a visionary. And this is kind of interesting. One of the things he wanted to do was to bring the jazz program into the university band scene.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is kind of interesting, his idea on this. Jazz was just starting in. Now, David Baker was at IU and making a name for himself there with IU's jazz program. And Jim had this idea, and this is very interesting looking at what's happened in the ensuing years. He said, this is something which has the potential to take over and become a thing all by itself that might impinge negatively on band programs. And he said, I think that college band directors need to get interested in this, and it would be to their benefit if they would make this part of their band programs.
Mm-hmm.
That was his idea. And so what he did for his 1969 convention at Tennessee is he brought the IU Jazz Ensemble with David Baker as one of the performing ensembles down from IU.
Yeah.
And because he was a personal friend of his, he had Stan Kenton come in as a prominent person to be there at the conference.
Wow.
And so Kenton did a sort of a session and related to the IU performance, and Jim was just had this in mind as something. Well, we need to get interested in this, and we need to get involved in it. We need to know about it. We need to get involved in it, and so forth. So that was something very interesting. And just as a personal aside, which some people might find interesting, I was one of the biggest Stan Kenton fans in the world. I just loved that band and the music and so forth. Yeah. And Jim knew this. So he realized that at the final banquet for the conference, I was not going to be doing anything, any speaking or having to do anything. I was just going to be up at the head table because I was a national officer.
Right.
And Kenton was not going to be doing anything. He wasn't going to speak or say anything at the banquet. The main reason for having him at the head table was just because he was such a prominent person brought to that conference. Mm-hmm. So Jim set the both of us together at the far end of the banquet table. And I had the whole night to just sit there and have personal chat with Stan Kenton.
That's like a dream come true.
Yeah, really. So anyway, that was really a wonderful thing. I know one other thing that doesn't relate to any of this, but I mentioned that Stan Kenton was at the 1969. Jim had him in the summer. There was a workshop that they had in the jazz area, and Jim had the Kenton Band on the Redlands campus. As a matter of fact, one of Stan Kenton's LPs is live from Redlands. Yeah. And so Jim and Stan were very, very good friends. And this doesn't relate to the conference, but one time Jim told me that after a workshop session day would be over with, he said Stan Kenton would go out to his home and just informally, he loved listening to the Eastman Wind Ensemble recordings. Isn't that fascinating as an insight into Kenton? And when I talk about him as a visionary, he also had another idea. He said, "Look, I have all kinds of high school band directors out in California." He was at the University of Redlands. "I have all kinds of high school band directors that are really interested in what we're doing in CBDNA." He wanted to create an associate membership for high school band directors. If they wanted to be associated with CBDNA, they could be an associate member. And he wanted that set up. And a long story short on that, I remember that it would be, when it came up, the board approved it, but it had to be approved by the membership. Yeah. And the membership turned it down. Yeah. Okay. Now, I remember that when it came up for a vote at the next, this would have had to have happened at the next convention in Texas. Yep. And it would have come up for a vote then. And what was interesting is one of Jim's best friends from his days as a student at the University of Wisconsin was Don Marcoulier, who was assistant, director of bands at Wisconsin and ended up as director of bands at Drake University in Iowa. And they were personal friends, but Don Marcoulier made a passioned statement against the resolution to do this. And his basis was, look, they've got their own association. There's no reason why they can't attend our meetings if they want to. Nothing is keeping them from doing that. But this really just needs to be an association for us. And so it got turned down. Who knows? But isn't that interesting that he would have, as a kind of a visionary, Jim would have that as an idea. And the other thing he came up with that I ended up participating in very much and gained a lot of knowledge and thoroughly enjoyed it during my 8 years was Jim came up with the idea that there should be a national officer in attendance at every regional conference.
Okay. Yep.
And so for a number of years, I don't know if that still happens, if they still try to do it, but for a number of years that happened. And I just happened to have a schedule at Iowa State that made me freer to go to these than some of the others. So I really enjoyed that as part of my time as Secretary-Treasurer. So anyway, that was Jim Jorgensen's time. The next president that I served was Guy Duker, and he was an assistant in Illinois. But Illinois is such a big band program that, someone who was one of the assistants there was very, very much a prominent person in CBDNA. And Guy Duker was really the first right-hand assistant to Mark Hinesley at the University of Illinois. And he was Secretary-Treasurer for a year and then got elected Vice President. And his conference was at the University of Texas, Austin, and William Moody was the host in 1971 at Texas. And the prominent person brought in then was Carl Husa. And Moody played I know that Moody played music for Prague. The one thing I remember that Moody played was the saxophone concerto with Fred Hemke as soloist from Northwestern. Now, that turned out to be one of the most fabulous performances I've ever heard. And because it came out as one of the top pieces,
Yep.
when I do my band lit class at Louisville, I have played that, year after year after year for many years. I've heard that recording time after time. Hemke does not miss one thing, except at the very end. He's going after one of those extremely high, soft, notes where you have to have all these cross fingerings to do it. And he loses it for an instant and gets it back immediately. And except for that, everything there. And I followed it with the score. It was a phenomenal performance. And, of course, Music for Prague was played. If Bill didn't do it, somebody did, and Husa was there. And there's a wonderful line from Husa over the years. Carol, that's where I first met Husa, and for various reasons, and he became associated with Louisville for various reasons which don't relate to CBDNA, but we became very, very good friends. And Karel Husa used to say to me, he said, I got to know you very well in 1971. He said, you were the source of my check. So there was that. Now, one thing happened during Duker's biennium that was very controversial. And poor guy got himself into a hornet's nest that really never did it turn into anything really bad. But the Chevrolet Motor Car Company contacted Guy Duker with an idea. And they were the sponsors that at that time they sponsored the game of the week on Saturday, right?
Yep.
There was only one. There was no ESPN. There was only one game of the week on Saturday afternoon. And Chevrolet came up with the idea that they wanted to run a contest and have the band that gave the best performance at halftime, say, be determined. And then at the end of the season, they wanted to have some process by which the best performance of the whole fall was given an award. Well, you can imagine, Guy thought, hey, wait, this is really terrific. Now all that he's not thinking about all the egos, right?
Yeah, right.
He's not thinking about all the egos involved in the profession. He's only thinking, wow, national exposure.
Yep.
What would this do? We've talked for years about why can't they pay more attention to what we're doing at games and so forth. He said, this is great. So he accepts it wholesale and sets up the whole process. And, of course, what it did is there were so many that really reacted negatively to it. It only happened once. Well, but it did happen. It did happen. And I was involved in at least 3 of them in terms of how that all transpired. It's probably of interest historically. The way it was set up was 2 college band directors and a celebrity guest. And Chevrolet had just put out the Vega. And so the celebrity guest was driven into the field at halftime in a Vega.
Oh, okay.
All right. So the celebrity guest was down on the field, and the first thing that I said at the very first one, I said to the Chevrolet execs, I said, look, you've got 2 college band directors up in the press box. You've got the celebrity guest down on the field. Now, that celebrity guest can't tell which is the best performance because that person can't see enough.
Right.
I said, what do we do? Supposedly all three of us are involved. And the Chevrolet exec said, you two in the press box decide, and that'll be it. So at any rate, we ran through the process, and then we had a committee that had been involved in it, met in Denver at the end of the season, and the winning group turned out to be Louisiana State under L. Bruce Jones.
Oh, okay.
That's before Frank Wicks got there.
Right.
So anyway, that was all part, and that was very controversial. And of course, it came up at board meetings and so forth. Jay Julian was one who was very, very much against it and very vocal about it. And his was on the basis we should not be bringing competition like this. The college band, the high school band field is riddled with competitive events. And this should not be something that's an aspect of the college band world at all. So it only happened that once, and it happened to Guy, and you could see why Guy thought it was a great idea, and you could also see why it became very controversial. One of the things that occurred, either in, I think it was Duker, is what's called the Educational Record Reference Library. ERRL. This turned out to be, to me, one of the most significant things that ever happened during my 8 years as Secretary-Treasurer. The publisher Franco Colombo came to the board with a proposal. Well, Franco Colombo was associated with the Italian publisher Ricordi. He was wealthy and did not need to make money from his publishing company. So he published scads of stuff because it ought to be published and didn't have to worry about whether it made money or not. And he said, I'd like to establish an educational record reference library where performances from high school and college concerts would be put on LPs, and it would be a subscription series that band directors could subscribe to. And he said, I have in mind 12 LPs a year. And he said that a subscription series, there would be 12 LPs a year. And he said we would have a committee that would decide whether or not submitted performances should be included on these. And he said, I have already talked to the Musicians Union. He said, I have their permission and approval for this project, that since they are educational concerts, there will be no problem with copyrights. He just went down the line. He had the whole blasted thing all worked out. We didn't have to do anything but say yes. And so what happened was he had Bellwin lined up to be the publisher involved in the subscription. Long story short, it became very much more of a complicated project than any of us envisioned in the beginning. So they began, and they were not able to complete 6 albums the first year. It took maybe 3 years or more.
Yep.
No, they were going to do 12 a year. I'm sorry. They ended up being able to produce 36, but it took many years to come up with 36.
Yeah.
And I remember when they got to LP album 36, that's when Bellwin said this will be the last. That became a wonderful resource. It turns out there are 157 items on those 36 LPs, all right? Absolutely half of them came out on the core repertoire in all 3 studies. with that being the case, it seems to me that has to be brought into first-class availability on CDs.
Yeah, or even better, put them up on YouTube.
And then, okay, that's what I remember most about Guy's biennium. The next was Dick Bowles, and Richard Bowles, he was at the University of Florida. He was very much more conservative as a thinker than someone like Jim Jorgensen. Guy Duker, you wouldn't necessarily label, conservative or liberal, but you could call Jim Jorgensen liberal and Dick Bowles conservative. Not in militant ways, but let's say traditional rather than conservative. So that was very much an aspect of his biennium. However, after the fiasco involving emblems and Aaron Copland and Keith Wilson trying to assemble the amount of money for the commission, well, after that experience, you see, the idea of commissions just sort of dissipated because of that experience. And I can't remember exactly when it came back again, but I think it may have been the University of Illinois convention under Dick Bowles' presidency at University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana.
Okay.
And Harry Beejan was host. And however, the commission, and I cannot remember whether the idea for this was Bowles or how it came up, but the commission went to Henk Baddings, Dutch composer, for a piece called Transitions. Do you know it?
I do know it.
Yeah. It's a nice piece, and I think it's sort of been set by the wayside and should be played more, in my opinion.
I want to go back real quick before we move on. So you talked about earlier about the 6 commissions and the voting program that was going on in your early days in CBDNA. Did that come to a grinding halt then when Emblems came out in 1964?
Well, I cannot remember. It's about that time that it did.
Okay.
And I cannot remember. That's where if I had the books of proceedings here, I could easily check. I would have to look in that. It was around that time. I do know that moving to the Baddings Commission, you could say that this was what was intended rather than the process. And I think it may have been about that time. That may have been a change when you went out from Chicago to Tempe. I don't know for sure, but I do know that the move toward commissioning, making a major commission to a major composer, was what they wanted to do rather than voting on a winning work. Yes, but okay. I can't tell you off the top of my head for sure. I'd have to check the books of proceedings.
Sure, I completely understand. Okay, back to the 73rd conference, or 73rd.
Okay, 73.
73.
So that, and another thing interesting was one of the performing groups was Jim Jorgensen.
Okay.
He brought the University of Redlands band out and had them play at the Illinois conference. So that's yet there. Then the next and my last president was Carl Holvik, who was at the University of Northern Iowa.
Okay.
And he was that was in 1975, and of course that occurred my first year. My second year at Louisville.
Yeah.
And so that was the conference where I finished up, and I did the book of proceedings and so forth for that conference. What I remember there is the person that Carl wanted very most to commission the piece from was from Howard Hanson. And so he wanted Howard Hanson to be the commission work. There were some who were not. I won't say there wasn't a lot of controversy over that, but there were some on the board who thought of Hansen as being more conservative as a composer than they would really like to commission. And there were those who, of course, very much wanted to try to get something out of Leonard Bernstein. But anyhow, he very much wanted Hansen, so the commission went to Hansen. Now, here's something that's interesting, and I made a note here that it was really Don Huntsberger that ended up getting that piece completed. Hansen was old, all right? He was older at the time that commission went to him. The piece that was the official CBDNA commission and premiered in 1975 at that conference at Berkeley, California, was Howard Hansen's Laude. But it was getting later and later and later, and Hansen wasn't really working on it.
Mm.
And Huntsberger just simply went to him and told him, look, these people are really expecting something from you. You really need to start thinking about it and really work on it. And this is a case of where you really need to come up with something that's significant. So it was Huntsberger's chiding that finally got Hansen to finish the work and to get it completed, which I find interesting just as a little side issue along the line. It wasn't that Hansen didn't want to do it. It's just that he's very much older than at the peak of his career. Right. That was my last president to serve. So I put the Book of Proceedings, and coming up with the Book of Proceedings from that conference was my last piece of work for CBDNA.
That's cool.
And I have in my notes that I put down here, that's when David Whitwell became president, and we went through all of that in the timely transfer to University of California, Berkeley.
So that leads us to your seminal literature study then that comes in and finishes up in 78, right? Because you were working on that while you were finishing up as Secretary-Treasurer, right? You started that at Iowa in 72, 73?
72 to 74 was my my years there as a grad student, and it took me 4 years at Louisville before I finished it.
So if I may, I just wanted to get your perspective on that. It's been, 43, if I'm doing the math right, 43 years since I got published in 1978.
Yes.
How do you feel that has contributed to the field in almost a half century now?
I didn't realize how much it had been useful to the profession until I retired. And then I decided in retirement that I was going to attend as many of the CBDNA Nationals as I could. Mm-hmm. And I began getting comments from directors about how they were using it in classes, and I would have students that were at the meetings would come up to me and they'd see my name tag and say, "Oh, I've read your stuff," and so forth. And that's when I began to realize. Now, I think the three of us, you included, with Jay Gilbert's replication and your replication, I think that those three documents are very, very significant. I was very, very fortunate. You see, my period of national prominence occurred very early because I was only a high school band director for 3 years and then went to Maryland. So I'm there at Maryland, and after 3 years as assistant and associate, I become director of bands. And Hugh Henderson's involved in setting up the research center and the ABA Journal of Research. And so I'm nurturing that, and I take that all out, plus the CBDNA, out to Iowa State with me, and so forth. Then I get to Louisville in 1974, and from there to retirement in 2001, you see, it's a very different sort of situation, and the Reeses sources are different. So all that period of national prominence happened very early in my career. And then I sort of, what?
I said, and it all started with that addressograph.
Which is fascinating, isn't it? I was also very fortunate in what I got at Michigan, but then I got away from Michigan. Mm-hmm. I ended up, I won't bore you with the details, but I ended up in West Hartford, Connecticut, because a fellow I'd worked for as assistant director in the summers in a music program was the other high school band director, and convinced them they needed me at the second high school. Mm-hmm. So I'm in West Hartford, Connecticut. I become good friends with Keith Wilson because I go down to Yale.
Yep.
And then when I end up at Maryland as assistant director, Hubert Henderson was very, very influential in both CBDNA and ABA, but he had a whole different set of people that he knew and introduced me to. One particularly, I think of, Don McGinnis and I became very good friends over the years, and I got to know Don through Hugh Henderson. Mm-hmm. And so the combination of the contacts and so forth from Michigan with those that Hugh Henderson gave me, so that when I became director of bands at Maryland, almost every one of those evaluators on my dissertation was a personal friend.
Yeah.
Which meant that helped a great deal in getting all of those people to do what I asked them to do. There's another thing that I think is very important. I have in mind sending an email to both of these guys, and I haven't done it yet, and I need to do it as soon as possible. And that is Don Huntsberger and Frank Battisti, because I want to thank them for being involved in all three.
Yeah. You're absolutely right.
To have those two very prominent CBDNA members and CBDNA presidents and ABA members and prominent in the field, and to have their input on all three studies gives them a continuity that they wouldn't have if it hadn't been for having those two guys on all three. There is something that's just simply related that I find very interesting, and it relates to our studies of the repertoire. And that is, it's kind of interesting to me that the official CBDNA commissions did not fare well. But isn't it interesting that of the CBDNA commissions that I really know of, see, it's only emblems. The others just did not make it into the core repertoire, which is fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah. And there's some irony there.
There certainly is. There certainly is. Yeah. There's something that I forgot to mention, and that was the importance in the early years of vice presidents' addresses. This was a keynote lecture given by each vice president, and along the way, CBDNA wanted to do something to permanently honor A.A. Harding with his name on something. So for Holvik's conference at UCal Berkeley, and someone could check, the whole ceremony was included in the Books of Proceedings. They came up with giving an A.A. Harding Award to each of the presidents for their contribution to CBDNA as president, and it was all the living presidents. And this was a ceremony at the final banquet. So what I came up with as a way of honoring, giving them this A.A. Harding Award, was to go back to each one of their vice presidents' addresses and picking quotes out. And so I simply quoted from their vice president's address before they came up to receive the A.A. Harding Award for their contribution as president. And that was a very nice event that I will always remember, because it was significant from the standpoint of awarding, giving an award to each of the presidents who were still living at the time, but also for those quotes from their vice president. That went by the wayside because our conferences got larger with more performances, and it didn't lend itself to a big block with everybody there for a keynote address, say. But the idea in the beginning was the vice president would give a major speech at the national conference with his agenda for the next biennium. A couple of things in terms of recent things that I was going to mention is, first of all, I'm interested in the number of wind recordings that you now hear on with classical radio MCs. We have a 24-hour WUOL here in Louisville, 24-hour classical. It's a wonderful station. And there are all the times, and generally there are two locally, and then there are these syndicated hosts, who can do their programs from anywhere. But a lot of them have been picking up on Jerry Junkin's Dallas Wind Symphony recordings. They've been picking up on Gene Corcoran's recordings and the Marine Band recordings. Those are three particularly that I've heard quite a bit on NPR, which I think is really exciting. And along with that, I don't know if they do it now, but evidently at one time CBDNA supported NPR through its composer's date book.
I don't think that CBDNA is sponsoring it. I know we did for years.
Yeah. My recommendation would be to do it again. I can't think of anything that gives better publicity for the college band movement and what it's become than that. I can't tell you how I beamed with pride so many times when I would hear composer's date book, and then it would end with, "This is brought to you by the College Band Directors National Association, who wants to remind you that all music was once new."
Yep.
I just sat there beaming with pride every time I heard it, and I have that down as one of the best things I think CBDNA has done. Anyhow, do you have anything that I haven't gotten to?
I've got one more question for you.
Yeah, good.
And this is a nice segue because you were talking about ideas for the future and things like that. What would you say, or what piece of advice would you give to those people that are joining us, that are newly minted, somebody that just got their, just got hooded this spring and has got their first job coming up? What would your advice be for them entering our field, getting involved in CBDNA?
My answer to that one is as soon as possible. I look at what it meant to me.
Yeah.
When that interest from, I'm sure, see, all of the groups that have performed, the students that have been part of that, I would like to hope they picked up something from that, like I got performing the CBDNA National with the University of Michigan Band. Mm-hmm. And that as soon as you can get involved and start attending conferences, it's not just the people you'll meet, but there's so much interesting material and so forth. And that's my only advice, as I say, is ASAP. Become a member as soon as possible.
Get involved, jump in with both feet type of a thing.
Sure, yeah.
Well, and you seem to have followed your own advice. So that's you definitely are living you definitely have lived your words, which is great.
Uh-huh.
Well, that's awesome. Well, thank you so much for talking with me today. I really appreciate it. I learned a ton today. Hopefully our listeners will continue to learn about the history of CBDNA through this project. And I really appreciate you being a part of it.
Well, I appreciate that comment, and I certainly enjoyed the time, and one of the most worthwhile activities I ever participated in.
Thank you so much.